I just wanted to get away. That was all it was supposed to be, a break. 1 week of solitude, away from work, news, and the constant noise of the world. No emails, no social media, no doom scrolling for the latest headlines. I had spent too much time wrapped up in a routine that felt like it was squeezing me tighter every day. The idea of heading deep into the wilderness, where the only thing I had to think about was keeping the fire going and making sure I didn't run out of food, was exactly what I needed. The war had been getting worse. That much I knew. Russia and Ukraine had been locked in their conflict for years. But lately, the news had been full of terms like escalation and full-scale retaliation. Some people at work had been talking about it, muttering about how it felt like the Cold War all over again. Someone had even mentioned something about nukes, but I hadn't paid much attention. It was always the same cycle: panic, speculation, and then everything going back to normal. That's how it always was. When I stopped at a small roadside diner before heading into the mountains, the tension in the air was noticeable. The usual hum of conversation was lower than normal, people speaking in hushed voices. A TV in the corner was tuned to a news station, the banner at the bottom of the screen flashing breaking news, but I didn't bother reading it. The waitress seemed distracted when she handed me my coffee, her gaze flicking to the television every few minutes. Even at the gas station down the road, there was a nervous energy, customers huddled together, checking their phones, whispering. I heard snippets of conversation, something about airspace being shut down, a speech from the president, something about Moscow's response. None of it concerned me. I wasn't naive. I knew tensions were high, but it felt distant, like something happening on another planet. People were always on edge about something, and the news was always one bad headline away from making the world seem like it was on the verge of collapse. But it never did. There was always something new to be afraid of, and yet, life kept moving. By the time I reached the mountains, the world behind me was already fading. The cabin was perfect, small but not cramped, nestled deep in the forest, with a small lake nearby and nothing but towering pines in every direction. It had everything I needed: canned food, a wood-burning stove, and enough firewood to last the week. No internet, no cell service, just silence. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. I hiked for hours, letting my legs burn as I climbed through dense trails. I fished in the lake, listening to the water ripple gently against the shore. The world felt slower, stretched out, as if time had loosened its grip. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the occasional call of a distant bird, and the crackling of the fire at night. But something felt different. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small, almost imperceptible moments. A deep tremor one night, just as I was falling asleep. It was low, distant, almost like thunder, but it came from the ground, a slow, rolling vibration that passed through the trees. I had dismissed it as a minor earthquake. Then there was the wildlife. On the third day, I was hiking when I spotted a group of deer moving quickly through the trees. They weren't just running, they were fleeing, heads low, bodies tense, sprinting as if something unseen was chasing them. I had stood still, listening, waiting for something, maybe a bear, maybe a wolf, to emerge from the woods behind them. But there was nothing, just silence, the kind that made the back of my neck itch. That night, I stepped outside to get more firewood and saw a glow on the horizon. It was faint, barely visible through the gaps in the trees. A dull, orange smear in the distance, like a fire burning far beyond the mountains. I had stared at it for a long time, trying to tell myself it was a storm. Maybe lightning had struck somewhere, igniting a fire in the dry brush. I went back inside and locked the door. The following day, I tried to push the unease away. There was no reason to let my imagination get the best of me. Whatever was happening out there, if anything was happening at all, was beyond my control. I had come out here to escape the world, and that's what I was going to do. For the rest of my trip, I refused to look at the horizon. The first sign that something was wrong came before I even reached the highway. The forest, once alive with the chatter of birds and the distant rustling of unseen animals, had fallen into complete silence. No bird song, no insects, not even the occasional creak of tree branches in the wind. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel natural, like the world itself was holding its breath. As I loaded my gear into the car, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. I told myself it was nothing, just a paranoia of being alone for a week. The isolation messing with my mind. The drive down the winding mountain road was uneventful at first, the dense trees blurring past as I descended towards civilization. It wasn't until I reached the last ridge before the open stretch of highway that I saw it. The cloud. It loomed in the distance, a monstrous column of smoke and fire stretching high into the sky, twisting into a shape that was impossible to mistake. A mushroom cloud. I slammed on the brakes, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. A wildfire, maybe a factory explosion. Any explanation other than the one my brain was screaming at me. But there was no denying the shape, the color, the horrifying scale of it. The sky around it burned with an unnatural orange glow, the upper edges of the cloud rolling outward like a slow-motion detonation frozen in time. I reached for my phone. No service. I refreshed the screen, tried calling, nothing. Just a blinking no signal where the bar should have been. The last notification before the blackout was still there, waiting for me like a final warning. Breaking. Russian nuclear missile detected inbound. The rest of the message was cut off. A tightness clenched in my chest. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I needed to move. I pressed the gas, speeding toward the highway, my mind racing faster than the car. How long had it been since the bomb fell? Minutes? Hours? Had there been more? As I neared the main road, the world around me started to change. The trees closest to the impact site were blackened, their trunks stripped bare. The air grew hazy, tinged with a fine layer of dust that clung to the windshield like pollen. Then I saw the cars. They were scattered along the highway in a way that made no sense. Some abandoned in the middle of the road, others crashed into ditches or against guardrails. Many had their doors flung open, like the drivers had fled in a hurry. Some were still running, headlights flickering through the thickening haze. I slowed down, weaving between them, my heart pounding. There were no bodies, no signs of people, just remnants of their presence. Discarded bags, spilled groceries, a child's shoe lying on the pavement. Further down, I saw an SUV with its back hatch open. Inside were suitcases, hastily packed, their contents spilling out onto the asphalt. Clothes, food wrappers, a half-empty water bottle rolling near the edge of the road. Someone had been preparing to leave in a hurry, but they hadn't made it. I kept driving. The sky darkened as I got closer to town, shifting from an eerie orange to a deep, suffocating gray. The air was thicker now, the dust swirling in the breeze, coating everything in a fine, ashen layer. It was getting harder to breathe. I needed gas. A station appeared on the side of the road, its neon sign flickering weakly. The place looked abandoned, but the lights inside were still on. I pulled up to the pump, stepping out cautiously. The ground was covered in footprints, scattered in all directions, some leading inside, some running toward the road. The door to the convenience store stood ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. I hesitated. The silence was oppressive, pressing against my skull like a vice. The footprints told a story I didn't want to read. People had been here, but where had they gone? A single receipt fluttered near my feet, half buried in the settling ash. It was recent. Someone had been here after the explosion. I peered inside the store. The shelves were ransacked, items knocked over in a rush. A register lay open, coins scattered across the counter. In the far corner, a cup of coffee sat abandoned on a table, steam still faintly rising from the surface. Whoever had been here, they hadn't left long ago. And yet, there wasn't a single soul in sight. The road into town was unrecognizable. Ash fell like slow-motion snow, drifting in silent, suffocating waves. It clung to the windshield, to the buildings, to the dead, skeletal remains of trees that had been stripped of their leaves. The houses that lined the streets were frozen in eerie snapshots of normal life. Cars still parked in driveways, front doors left open, porch lights flickering in the haze. Something had happened here, something worse than the blast itself. A single bird spiraled down from the sky, its wings twitching, body convulsing as it hit the pavement. It lay still for only a moment before a final, weak shudder passed through it. Then nothing. He kept driving. Windows were shattered in nearly every storefront, glass scattered across sidewalks. Inside, restaurants sat abandoned mid-meal, plates still on tables, drinks half empty. A grocery cart tipped over near an intersection, cans rolling lazily along the street. Nobody is. That was the worst part. The absence of people. It was as if the entire town had been vacuumed out, leaving behind only dust and ruins. And then movement. A figure staggered into view, barely visible through the thick, gray air. A woman, barefoot, her clothes covered in soot. She moved slowly, her posture hunched, one hand gripping her stomach. Each step looked like a struggle. For the first time since leaving the cabin, he wasn't alone. He pulled over and stepped out, the ash crunching softly beneath his boots. He lifted a hand in silent greeting, hoping she would see him, recognize that he wasn't a threat. But as soon as her gaze met his, her eyes widened in terror. She turned and ran. Her bare feet slapped against the pavement as she bolted, coughing violently between gasps of breath. She didn't look back. Something about the way she fled sent a cold wave of dread through his chest. He wanted to call out, to ask if she was okay, but the words caught in his throat. What had she seen? Why was she so afraid? He hesitated, then forced himself back into the car. There was only one place left to go. Home. The drive was a blur of ruined streets and abandoned vehicles, a wasteland stretching through what had once been familiar neighborhoods. The houses on his block stood intact, but something about them felt wrong. His own house loomed at the end of the street, untouched by whatever had happened here. The windows weren't broken. The door wasn't ajar. From the outside, it looked just as he had left it. Inside, the silence was deafening. Dust covered everything. The furniture, the kitchen counters, the framed photos lining the walls. A coffee mug sat on the table, the liquid inside long since evaporated, leaving behind a dark ring of residue. A plate of food rested nearby, fork still stabbed into a half-eaten bite. The chairs around the table were knocked over. Something had made them leave in a hurry. He moved through the house, checking every room, every corner, searching for any sign that someone was still here. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of something chemical, something burnt. His parents were gone. No notes, no clues, just the eerie remnants of a life interrupted. He pulled out his phone, fingers shaking as he powered it on. The screen flickered, lagging under the weight of dozens of missed calls and unread messages. The last text from his mother was short, hurried. "We're leaving. Please be safe." The voicemail came next. Her voice was frantic, the words tumbling over themselves in a rush of fear. "Oh God, they said it wasn't supposed to hit us. They said it was going for DC, but static." The message cut off abruptly, leaving only an empty silence that stretched far too long. Then, the radio crackled to life. A single voice, flat and emotionless, repeated the same message in a monotonous loop. "This is a government emergency broadcast. All survivors must seek shelter immediately. Do not stay in open areas. Await further instructions." The words droned on, over and over, through the static. Outside, the ash continued to fall. He needed answers. The emergency broadcast played on a loop, the same robotic voice urging survivors to seek shelter, repeating like a broken record. But nothing about this felt safe. The silence, the empty streets, the woman who had fled at the mere sight of him. Something was wrong. The city was the only place that might still have people. Someone had to be out there. Someone had to know what was happening. He drove. The closer he got, the worse it became. The suburbs faded into hollowed-out remnants of civilization. Buildings stripped to skeletal frames, cars left in tangled wrecks on the roads. Fires still burned in some places, their embers flickering through the ash-thickened air. A layer of gray dust coated everything, turning the world into a smear of death and silence. It looked like a war zone, but there was no sign of a battle. No bodies, no blood. Just absence. Military vehicles littered the roads, their engines dead, their doors hanging open. A Humvee sat at an intersection, the mounted guns still facing outward, as if prepared for a fight that never came. A convoy of transport trucks had been abandoned near a checkpoint, the barricades toppled, weapons left behind. It was as if an entire army had vanished into thin air. The city skyline was barely visible through the thick haze, its tallest buildings reduced to blackened husks. Glass crunched under his tires as he maneuvered through the ruined streets, avoiding the wreckage. The emergency broadcast continued, over and over. Seek shelter. Await further instructions. Help is coming. Then, in the middle of the static, something changed. A new voice broke through, a whisper, urgent and raw. It was impossible to tell if it was a recording or someone speaking live. If anyone is still alive, do not go to the shelters. They're not safe. There. The signal cut out. The robotic voice returned, droning on as if nothing had happened. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. Someone was out there. Someone who knew more than the repeating loop of false reassurance. The gas station appeared on the side of the road, like an oasis in the devastation. Its lights still flickered weakly, the neon sign half burned out. It was built like a bunker, concrete walls, heavy metal shutters pulled halfway down. A single figure moved inside, barely visible through the grime-covered windows. He pulled in, stepping out cautiously. The air was thick with the scent of burnt plastic and something metallic. His boots left imprints in the ash as he approached. Inside, the station was a mess. Shelves overturned, supplies ransacked. But someone had made a home here. Blankets piled in a corner, a lantern flickering beside an old radio. The man sitting there was gaunt, his clothes stained with dust, his hands trembling as he clutched a map. He barely looked up as he slid the paper across the counter. The map was old, creased, the edges curling from wear. Red XS had been marked across it. Intersections, cities, places that no longer existed. He stared at it, his mind struggling to process what he was looking at. The old man finally spoke, his voice hollow, stripped of emotion. Russia hadn't just hit the US. They had hit everything. Europe, Asia, the Middle East, all gone. Whatever he had woken up to, it wasn't just a war. It was the end of the world. The man pointed to the map again, his fingers tapping one of the XS near the outskirts of the city. There was no explanation, only that silent warning. Then, finally, a whisper, a single phrase that sent ice crawling up his spine. Avoid the ones in the masks. The old man didn't say anything else. He just turned the radio up, drowning out whatever conversation they might have had. The emergency broadcast continued, its robotic voice echoing through the station. Seek shelter. Await further instructions. Help is coming. But they both knew it wasn't. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty. The deeper he drove into the wasteland, the more the world felt unreal, like something was unraveling around him, thread by thread. Everything human had been scraped away. The highway led him to what had once been a military checkpoint. The remnants of barricades stood like the ribs of a carcass, metal twisted and half buried in the layers of dust. Vehicles, armored, massive, sat lifeless in the road, their engines cold, their doors yawning open like the mouths of corpses. Weapons had been abandoned mid-use. A rifle leaned against a concrete barrier, its magazine still full. A pile of gear was scattered across the ground. Helmets, gas masks, body armor, dropped in a rush. But no bodies. The absence of the dead was worse than the presence of them. It meant something had happened here that didn't leave remains. The sky above was thick, the sun barely a dull smear behind a ceiling of rolling gray clouds. It shifted too much for comfort. Not just the wind stirring the dust, something within it, moving, watching. Further down the road, through the haze, figures appeared. At first, they looked like distant survivors, stumbling between the ruins. But as they grew clearer, he realized they weren't moving like people. Their motions were too deliberate, too synchronized, as if following an unseen command. Hazmat suits. They glided through the wreckage, slow and methodical, sweeping strange, humming devices over the ground. Their heads tilted unnaturally, like they were listening to something only they could hear. The sight of them sent a deep, primal warning through his chest. Then, as if sensing him, one turned its head. It had no face, no eyes behind a plastic visor, no mouth beneath the mask. Just an empty, featureless surface where a human face should have been. He froze. His breath hitched. The figure didn't move at first. Then, slowly, it raised one gloved hand and pointed directly at him. The radio crackled again, sudden and sharp. But this time, it wasn't the emergency broadcast. A new voice, barely more than a whisper, filled the static. "They're not here to help us." A deep, suffocating sense of wrongness filled the air. He didn't wait. Slamming his foot onto the gas, he turned the car sharply, tires screeching against the cracked asphalt. The faceless figures didn't chase him. They only stood there, watching, their heads following his retreat as he sped away. The old man's map lay crumpled on the passenger's seat, red excess marking places he couldn't go, places that no longer existed. He gripped it tightly, knuckles white. The world was gone, and whatever had taken its place was something he didn't understand. Above him, the sky churned, shifting in unnatural currents. Something was moving inside the clouds.